There is a version of this story that everyone has already accepted. The version where a masked figure approaches a front door in the dark, pulls out a device, presses a button, and the neighborhood goes blind. Clean, cinematic, terrifying in its efficiency. A Wi-Fi jammer. That was the theory. That was the frame that dominated 6 weeks of coverage, 6 weeks of analysis, 6 weeks of the public understanding this crime as the work of someone who showed up prepared with technology. That frame is incomplete. And the evidence that emerged on day 37 of this investigation changes something fundamental about how this crime was actually executed, not because a jammer wasn't involved, but because the surveillance blackout appears to have begun long before the masked figure ever set foot on Nancy Guthrie's street. There is a utility box around the corner from Nancy's home. It sits where utility boxes always sit, against a wall, unremarkable, the kind of infrastructure no one notices until it stops working. That box was found damaged, and investigators from the Pima County Sheriff's Department confirmed on March 9th that they are actively reviewing it as part of the ongoing investigation, specifically in connection with the internet outage that residents reported in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood during the early morning hours of February 1st. The outage that darkened Ring cameras. The outage that left one neighbor's footage marked not available during the precise window when investigators believe Nancy was taken. The question everyone has been asking for 6 weeks is how one person with a handheld device could have knocked out internet service across a wide enough radius to affect multiple homes simultaneously. NBC News noted in its own reporting that achieving that level of disruption would require professional-grade equipment, not the consumer market jammers you find described in online forums. What nobody was asking until now is a simpler and far more disturbing question. What if the internet in that neighborhood wasn't jammed from outside? What if someone physically damaged the infrastructure first? That distinction matters more than it might seem. A jammer is something you carry to a crime scene. A damaged utility box is something you create before one. To understand why that difference changes everything about the profile of this suspect, you need to understand what reconnaissance actually looks like in the days and weeks before a deliberate act of this kind. Because the physical evidence from the utility box does not exist in isolation. It sits alongside a witness account that has received almost no attention in mainstream coverage, an account that places a specific, unfamiliar figure in that neighborhood approximately 3 weeks before Nancy Guthrie disappeared. Her name is Aldine. She is a neighbor in the Catalina Foothills community, and she spoke publicly for the first time on March 9th in an interview with the Brian Enton Investigates podcast. What she described is not ambiguous. Around January 11th, roughly 20 days before the morning of February 1st, she saw a man she did not recognize. His hat was pulled low. He did not belong there in the way that residents of close-knit neighborhoods recognize each other without exchanging words, the accumulated familiarity of years of seeing the same faces. Aldine said she mentioned it to both her husband and her mother at the time because it unsettled her enough to articulate out loud. She told the interviewer, not often at all. She knows the people she sees. 12 years ago once, she'd seen a strange man. This felt the same way. She spoke with the FBI after Nancy disappeared. Investigators have not publicly confirmed whether the sighting connects to the masked suspect in the doorbell camera footage. But place those two facts side by side and something begins to take shape. A man in a low-pulled hat walking through a neighborhood on January 11th that he had no apparent reason to be in. A utility box around the corner from a specific home, damaged in a way that may have contributed to a neighborhood-wide internet outage 6 weeks later. The question that connects those two data points is not a dramatic one. It is a methodical one. How many visits does it take to identify and access the specific piece of infrastructure that, if compromised, would blind the surveillance ecosystem of a target block? The answer is, not many, but it requires at least one. And it requires someone who either has technical knowledge of how residential internet infrastructure is laid out, the junction boxes, the cable routing, the service nodes that, if damaged, would cause cascading outages rather than isolated ones, or someone who had time to learn it. This is where the behavioral picture of this case begins to shift in a direction that the dominant narrative, the jammer narrative, never fully accounted for. The jammer theory positioned the suspect as someone arriving on the night of February 1st, with technological tools already in hand, executing a plan that was primarily digital in its architecture. Sophisticated, yes, but self-contained. A single-night operation with a device as its centerpiece. The utility box changes that architecture completely. Because damaging physical telecommunications infrastructure in a residential neighborhood is not something you do with a smartphone or a laptop. It requires physical presence at a specific location. It requires access to a piece of equipment that is not inside someone's home, but is also not visible from the street in the way a front door camera is. You have to know where it is. You have to get close enough to damage it. And you have to do that without drawing attention in a neighborhood where the residents know each other well enough that one of them noticed an unfamiliar face weeks later and still remembered it clearly enough to describe it to the FBI. What that suggests about the timeline of this crime is something the public has not fully reckoned with. The investigation has been proceeding on the working assumption, stated or implied in virtually every official briefing, that February 1st was the beginning, that the planning happened off-site, that the suspect arrived equipped, executed the plan, and left. But if the utility box damage is confirmed as connected to the outage, then February 1st was not the beginning. It was the endpoint of a process that started at least weeks earlier, in the same neighborhood, on foot, in daylight or near darkness, by someone who was already there. The implications of that for the investigation are significant. Cell tower records are among the most powerful forensic tools available to investigators in a case like this. Every phone communicates with nearby towers whether or not the user is making a call. It registers. It logs. It creates a record of geographic presence that can be subpoenaed from carriers. Investigators have confirmed that cell data was among the evidence streams pointing them toward desert coordinates in the Week 6 search that Ashley Banfield reported. What has not been publicly established is the scope of the cell data review. Whether investigators are looking only at the night of February 1st, or whether they have extended the query window to include the weeks before, specifically the period around January 11th, when Aldine saw the man with the low-pulled hat. If they have not yet done that, the utility box development gives them a specific and documented reason to. A phone present in the Catalina foothills area on January 11th, and again in the early morning hours of February 1st, belonging to someone with no documented connection to the neighborhood, would represent a correlation that cell carrier records could confirm or eliminate within days. Now let's talk about what the internet outage actually did, because the full picture of what was lost that night has not been clearly assembled in any single place in the public record, and it matters for understanding why the surveillance architecture of this crime was so precisely targeted. Multiple residents in the Catalina foothills neighborhood reported internet disruptions beginning around 2 a.m. on February 1st. One neighbor whose Ring camera sits closest to Nancy's home found their footage from that window marked "not available." That is not the behavior of a camera that lost power. That is the behavior of a camera that was actively recording and attempting to upload to cloud infrastructure when its connection to that infrastructure was severed. The camera tried to do its job. The network it depended on was not there. For residents who had active cloud subscriptions on their cameras, unlike Nancy, whose Nest device was not connected to a paid cloud plan, that outage meant footage that would normally have been continuously pushed to remote servers was instead sitting in local storage during the interruption. Whether it was ultimately recovered depends on what happened to each individual device and whether connectivity was restored before the local buffer was overwritten. What investigators were left with across an entire neighborhood during a critical 41-minute window was a patchwork of gaps, partial recordings, and locally stored fragments rather than the continuous cloud-backed visual record that modern residential surveillance is designed to produce. The camera on Camino Real, half a mile outside the original search perimeter, was not affected in the same way and contributed 12 vehicles to the investigative picture, including the possible Kia Soul recorded at 2:36 a.m., 8 minutes after the pacemaker application lost its connection to Nancy's phone. But that camera existed outside the radius of disruption. The cameras inside it did not. The FBI's forensic video recovery from Nancy's own doorbell camera, the 44 seconds retrieved from back-end Google infrastructure because the device had communicated residual data to servers before the tampering, was a recovery despite the plan, not because of any gap in it. The suspect's interference with the physical device, combined with the broader network outage, should have produced total visual silence. It almost did. 44 seconds survived. The rest of the neighborhood's surveillance record for that window is incomplete in ways that cannot now be reconstructed. This is what a pre-planned infrastructure attack accomplishes that a jammer alone cannot. A jammer affects devices in real time. It creates a window of wireless interference, but it operates against systems that were functioning normally until the moment it was activated, and it creates a pattern of disruption that has a clear start time and a clear source location, the person carrying it. Physical damage to a utility box creates a different kind of disruption, one that can precede the crime by hours, days, or longer. One that doesn't require the suspect to be carrying a wireless device during the operation itself. One that leaves a different forensic trace, not radio frequency interference that investigators can map back to a source device, but physical damage to infrastructure that may or may not be definitively tied to a specific person through traditional forensic means. The sophistication of that approach is of a different order than a jammer, and it connects to something that retired FBI Special Agent Jennifer Coffindaffer said publicly when asked about the most likely path to solving this case. She said that in her judgment, the number one way this investigation gets resolved is someone coming forward who personally knows the suspect, a family member, a partner, someone who, in the weeks before February 1st, noticed behavior that didn't fit, unusual absences, research into neighborhoods or infrastructure, a purchase that didn't make sense, questions about how utility systems work. The reason Coffindaffer landed on that pathway rather than the forensic one is not pessimism about the evidence. It is professional experience with cases where the suspect's operational competence was high enough to limit the physical trace they left behind. The DNA from the gloves found 2 miles from Nancy's home. The evidence that generated extraordinary public attention in the early weeks of the investigation was traced to a local restaurant worker with no connection to the case. 16 pairs of gloves were ultimately collected from the search area. The majority belonged to members of the search teams. The lead that seemed most concrete in week 3 dissolved. That does not mean the forensic genealogy pathway is closed. The biological material collected from inside Nancy's home, distinct from Nancy's own DNA and from those in her immediate circle, confirmed by the Pima County Sheriff's Department, is still being processed. Forensic genealogy, the methodology that identified the Golden State Killer after decades through consumer ancestry databases, does not depend on a prior criminal record. It builds family trees from partial biological matches and narrows them against every other evidence stream until candidates can be compared against the full profile. That process takes weeks to months. It does not yield to the pressure of a news cycle. But when it produces a result, that result is definitive in a way that no tip, no witness account, and no retail transaction record can match. What investigators now have with the utility box development is a potential bridge between the forensic genealogy work and the physical reconnaissance timeline. If the biological material from inside the home produces a genealogy candidate, a specific person whose family tree overlaps with the partial profile, investigators will immediately run that individual against every evidence stream they have built over 38 days. Cell records for the Catalina foothills area. Vehicle registrations cross-referenced against the Kia Soul footage. Transaction records at local Walmart stores for the specific items documented in the doorbell camera footage. And now, physical connection to the neighborhood in the weeks before February 1st. Aldine's sighting of an unfamiliar man on January 11th is not evidence of guilt. It is not a suspect identification. What it is, in the context of everything else, is a timestamp. A date by which someone whose identity investigators may be approaching from the genealogy direction could potentially be placed in the neighborhood through cell data, through additional witness canvassing, through any number of the investigative threads that a dedicated task force, 5 Pima County homicide detectives working alongside FBI agents full-time, is now following simultaneously. Sheriff Chris Nanos said on March 3rd that investigators are definitely closer. He said it publicly on the record in an interview that aired on the Today Show. Nanos is not a man who has been reckless with his words in this investigation. He has been measured, sometimes frustratingly so for a public that has been waiting for answers for more than a month. When he says definitely closer, with the emphasis he placed on that word, the investigative picture around the utility box and the January reconnaissance timeline suggests he has reason to mean it. The task force formation itself is a signal worth reading carefully. Dedicated task forces are not formed for cases that are cooling. They are formed for cases that have reached the phase where the evidence work is no longer about volume, processing 50,000 tips, canvassing an entire neighborhood, collecting gloves from a search radius, but about depth, following specific threads to their ends, running specific names against specific evidence streams. The kind of work that 5 experienced homicide investigators and a team of federal agents can do more effectively than a surge operation of 400 personnel because it requires concentration rather than coverage. There is also the matter of accomplices. Multiple experts involved in the investigation have said publicly that the person responsible may not have acted alone. That assessment, when placed against the utility box timeline, carries more analytical weight than it did before. Damaging telecommunications infrastructure in a residential neighborhood without being observed requires either extraordinary good fortune or a level of operational awareness about when and how infrastructure workers move through an area that suggests either prior knowledge of utility service schedules or a second person providing situational awareness. These are possibilities, not conclusions. But they are possibilities that the evidence now actively supports in a way that the jammer-only theory never fully resolved. The Ransom communications remain one of the most contested dimensions of this case. The notes that arrived at media outlets, not at the Guthrie family directly, not through channels that would allow a negotiation to actually function, demanded $6 million in cryptocurrency and set a deadline that passed without any confirmation that Nancy Guthrie was alive. John Miller, CNN's senior law enforcement analyst, described them as a one-way conversation. Not the architecture of a genuine ransom demand, which requires a response mechanism, a proof-of-life protocol, a channel through which a family can confirm their relative is breathing before any transfer is made. These notes had none of that. What they had was inside knowledge of the property, details about Nancy's home that suggested familiarity with the space. That familiarity, in the context of a reconnaissance timeline that may have extended weeks into January, is no longer surprising. Someone who was in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood on January 11th, studying infrastructure, learning the layout of the streets, identifying the specific utility junction that would need to be compromised, that person had time to know things about Nancy Guthrie's property that a stranger could not. And yet the ransom notes arrived at TMZ and at local Tucson television stations rather than at the people who would need to respond to them. That structural impossibility, a ransom demand with no mechanism for response, has led multiple analysts to conclude that the communications were not a negotiation opening. They were a narrative deployment, a frame designed to redirect investigative attention and public expectation toward a living hostage scenario during the period when the physical evidence was still being processed and the forensic picture was still incomplete. Savannah Guthrie stood in front of cameras and kept every door open, including the hardest one. She said her family knew that Nancy might be lost. She said she still had hope. She addressed whoever had taken her mother directly and asked only for proof that she was breathing. In more than 30 days of those appeals, whoever sent those initial notes to the media never provided a photograph, a voice recording, or a single word confirming that Nancy Guthrie had survived the 41-minute window that began at 1:47 in the morning on February 1st. What the blood on the front porch tells investigators, analyzed by forensic pathologist Dr. Michael Batten, whose career in courtroom testimony spans decades, is that something happened at the threshold with enough force to cause facial or nasal bleeding in an 84-year-old woman with limited mobility. The droplets, donut-shaped under forensic examination, are consistent with blood that falls from the face or respiratory tract rather than from a wound on an extremity. They were found at the entry point, not inside, not deeper in the house. At the place where the 41-minute window began, and the darkness outside met the home that Nancy had returned to safely just hours before. The investigation is not over. The task force is working. The genealogy is running. The utility box is being processed. The cell data for the weeks before February 1st may now be within the scope of an active evidence request that the Aldine sighting and the physical infrastructure damage have jointly justified. The vehicle from the Ring camera on the back road, recorded 8 minutes after the pacemaker went silent, remains an active lead. The investigators who were definitely closer on March 3rd are 6 days further into their work today. Nancy Ellen Long Guthrie was born on January 27, 1942. She raised 3 children in Arizona. Her grandchildren adore her. She attended Sunday services at St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church, and her congregation has prayed for her return every Sunday since she disappeared. She was dropped at her garage door at 9:50 in the evening on January 31st after a card game with her family. She did not emerge the following morning. Somewhere between that ordinary ending to an ordinary evening and the moment the utility box around the corner was damaged, a decision was made and a plan was set in motion. The cameras did not die on the night they were needed to see. They died before he arrived by design, as part of a preparation that may have begun walking the same streets Nancy had walked for years, in a hat pulled low, 3 weeks before anyone knew to be afraid. The evidence is still being pulled. The threads are converging. And the one thing that changes when you understand this crime as beginning in January rather than February is the scale of what the forensic record may actually contain. Not one night's worth of cell tower activity, not one transaction at a Walmart, but weeks of a person moving through a neighborhood they had decided to enter permanently, leaving traces in the infrastructure, in the memory of a neighbor who noticed something wrong, and in the systems that quietly log the movement of every device that passes through a cell network, whether or not its owner intended to be recorded. He thought the darkness was enough. He thought the hat was enough. He thought the utility box around the corner would handle the rest. The investigation is 38 days old. The task force is 5 detectives and a team of federal agents working full-time. The genealogy database holds more than 26 million profiles. And somewhere in the cell carrier records for the Catalina foothills area, a phone was already there in January, already present, already building the architecture of what was going to happen. That record does not disappear. It was made. It exists. And investigators who are definitely closer are reading it. If you have any information about the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, contact the FBI immediately at 1-800-CALL-FBI. Submit tips at tips.fbi.gov. The Pima County Sheriff's tip line is 520-351-4900. The combined reward stands at over $1,200,000, payable anonymously.